In January of 1985, The Clash headed off to Germany to record their sixth studio album. The recordings took place inside Warrington Studios. Michael Fayne talked about the beginning of the recording sessions. Bernie really liked the studio manager and the vibe of the place. It was a little sterile for a punk record, I thought. It was ultra clean and they were ultra modern, but I was glad to be along for the ride. Norman Watt Roy and several other studio musicians began to lay down some basic rhythm tracks along with Fayne's programmed drum beats. Joe Strummer was on hand to witness his songs being reconstructed painstakingly by the studio musicians while trying to keep a positive attitude about the recording of the album, while Bernie Rhodes supervised the goal of giving the Clash a modernized sound. Fayne said it's about Rhodes' vision of the Clash. He had this utopian vision of the Clash becoming an even bigger band if he could modernize it and spruce it up a bit. He could create something new, but if you have something that works, if you don't want to futurize it, you tweak it. You don't effing come into a room and paint everything and decide the curtains are wrong. You don't, because you lose people that love you for who you are. Out of the many studio musicians he tried out, Rhodes picked the studio's engineer, Herman Weindorf, to play the keyboards and synthesizers. He gave him the alias of Young Wagner. None of the studio guitars were suitable for Rhodes' liking, so he brought in Nick Sheppard to play on the album. He said about the experience, "I'd come up with these guitar lines in the demo sessions with Joe, but once we got to Munich, they were dismissed by Bernie because I'd come up with them. He said, 'You came up with that. It can't be any good.' By the time I got to Munich, I didn't feel like I was in the Clash at all. I didn't feel like I was part of any commando gang that was going to take over the world with rebel rock. I just kind of went with the guitar and no idea what I was going to be faced with." Only two of the five members of the Clash were going to be playing on the album. Paul Simonon was replaced by Norman Watt Roy, and Sheppard was going to play all the guitar tracks, and Pete Howard was replaced by a drum machine. Eventually, the rest of the band would travel to Munich on their own dime, but Rhodes refused to use them in the studio, so they just hung around their hotel room waiting for a phone call from their manager on if they were ever going to be used on the album. Vince White talked about his trip to Munich with Pete Howard. "Maybe it was one of Bertie's punishments. We didn't know what we did bad, and suddenly me and Pete were driving across Europe. I'll never forget it. It was in January with sub-zero temperatures. The effing van froze up. The radiator froze. Everything froze. The van was totally freezing, and we arrived there in 6 feet of snow. In the studio, Bernie was surrounded by all this high-tech musical production equipment and was lost. He was trying to put his vision of the Clash into music, but he had no idea how to make it into reality." Michael Fayne said, "At the time, I wasn't a producer myself. I was barely the engineer, but even I thought it was crazy. I thought it was suicide. The sessions were very labored. You couldn't really find the vibe. It wouldn't have been painful if it wasn't so contrived. It was awful. I felt like I was a soldier involved in a massacre who was saying, 'I'm only obeying orders.' I wasn't doing the work on my own. I had Bernie sitting there. He'd go, 'Right, we need some of that.' And da 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 da. 'How about if we do this and that?' I didn't even have carte blanche." Nick Sheppard also talked about Bernie Rhodes trying to produce the album in the studio. "Bernie was out of control. Nothing was good enough, and when he didn't like something, he's going to tell you in the nastiest way possible. Bernie was making a brave attempt to do something. I don't think he thought he was Mick. He was trying to make a record with everything in it. He wanted to make a punk record, and a rap record, and a modern record." Joe Strummer, however, believed in Bernie Rhodes' vision of making the album and threw everything he had into it. When Nick Sheppard tried to tell Joe about the frustration he was going through with the manager in the studio, he retorted by saying, "No, I don't want to hear it. I have got to believe in this. I've got to believe this is the right thing." Bernie spent a few months in the studio. He had a 48-track mixer and tried to fill in the tracks that were available with music, giving the songs a very cacophonic sound. Nick Sheppard had this to say about Bernie's music production. "Bernie didn't know when to stop. His idea of producing was to cram every conceivable space with something, and he had 48 tracks to work with. Making the record was quite a long and pretty horrendous process. It seemed like an age, and I was there for most of it. Joe was there for all of it." At the end of the recordings, all 5 members of The Clash were invited to the studio and they recorded the songs Sex Mad Roar and Do It Now. The tracks showcase what the album should have sounded like if they recorded it the way Joe Strummer originally wanted it to. The final insult was that these songs were put on the B-side of the album single, This Is England. Michael Fayne appears on the album, singing co-vocals on the song Play to Win and programmed the drum machine that's heavily featured on the album. Nick Sheppard sings co-lead vocals on the song North and South, a track he came up with that was inspired by the striking miners' benefit shows that they played, along with all of the guitar parts on the album that were multi-layered. Norman Watt Roy laid down all of the bass tracks with the exception of the synthesizer bass tracks, which were composed along with the keyboards by Young Wagner. Joe Strummer sang on all the vocals, and the music was produced and co-written by Bernie Rhodes using the nom de plume Jose Unidos. The tapes were taken back to England, where he tinkered with the music during post-production. Inspired by the Clash's 2-week busking tour of England and Scotland in May of 1985, Rhodes decided to add more background vocals to some of the tracks. He invited 100 of the band's family and friends into a recording studio to work on the vocals. Nick Sheppard had this to say about the added background vocals. I think they were added to make that connection of when that massive crowd sings, "We Are the Clash." The idea is that the Clash belongs to the audience, you know. The audience are as much the band as the band is. It was done after the tour, but I don't know if Joe had come up with the idea as a result of the busking. I have a feeling it was more to do with Bernie, to be honest. And as I said before, Bernie did have some great ideas. Bernie Rhodes mixed the album with the added backing vocals and spent days trying to find the perfect mix of punk, hip-hop, and electronic music, and keeping the band members in the dark about the album's final sound. Sheppard said Bernie's basic vision of mixing punk and electronic music to update the Clash in itself had something to it. The first single from the album was This Is England, which showcased the new Clash sound and was released on September 30th, 1985. The single charted in the UK, peaking at number 24 on the charts. Around the time the single was released, Joe Strummer ran off to Spain, leaving the rest of the band to ponder their future. A huge tour of Europe was planned in October to promote the single along with a music video that was being prepared for This Is England. Those close to Strummer felt that the new updated Clash sound was the straw that broke the camel's back, despite being pleased with the end results of the Munich recordings and signing off on them. According to guitarist Nick Sheppard, maybe the busking tour put Joe in a different reality. It put us all in a very, very different reality for a while there. Because let's face it, that's what Joe is. He's Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, a minstrel, a troubadour. Imagine going back after doing the tour and listening to that record. Joe Strummer is not the guy you associate with drum machines and synthesizers. With Strummer gone and Simonon not caring about the band anymore, the trio of Vince White, Pete Howard, and Nick Sheppard were left to deal with the fallout of the album's release on November 5th, 1985. Cut the Crap, which was originally titled Out of Control, but with no tour to promote it, no music videos, no singles, or a band, peaked at number 16 in the UK and then faded away into obscurity. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Cuppy's Music Curios. My name is Cuppy, and I hope to see you soon. Cheerio!